Well, it's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce a personal friend, Dr. Erel Shalit. Let me give you a little bit of background. Erel is the past president of the Israeli Society of Analytical Psychology. He was also on the ethics committee of the International Association for Analytical Psychology for many years and made great contributions there. He's the founder and past director of the Analytical Psychotherapy program at Bar Ilan University in Tel Aviv, and the past director of the Shammai Davidson Community Mental Health Center at the Shalvata Psychiatric Center.
You got it right.
Thank you. He's published a number of books. Recently, The Cycle of Life, Themes and Tales of the Journey, The Hero and His Shadow, The Complex, and then some edited volumes together with Nancy Ferlotti, Dream and Its Amplification in 2013. Then just this year with Marie Stein, Turbulent Times, Creative Minds, Erich Neumann, and C.G. Jungian Relationship, 1934 to 1960, which will be the topic of much of our discussion today. And finally, he is just now producing several works of Neumann's that have been previously unpublished. Last year, the book on Jacob and Esau, on the collective symbolism of the brother motif came out. It's an extraordinary, fascinating book and long overdue, I think. So with that brief introduction, let me welcome you, Erel.
Thank you, Joe. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very excited that Pacifica, you, Steve Eisenstadt, and Pacifica are putting up this symposium of a dialogue between Carl Jung and Erich Neumann.
Yes, I think it's it's part of our 40th anniversary celebration, and it seems such a timely event. As in the last several years, we've seen a number of correspondences come out. We're reaching that point in the kind of scholarly history of C.G. Jung and some of his closest disciples and thought leaders. And perhaps you can start orienting us today to exactly who Neumann was and why he's coming into such recognition at this moment.
I think you're pointing in the right direction. There is a kind of revival of Erich Neumann, who was very significant in Jungian circles in the 1950s. He died prematurely at the age of 55 in 1960. And he has been recognized all through the years, but there is a revival. As part of that revival, or as a central feature, I think, of that revival, is the very recent publication of the correspondence between Jung and Neumann. It's quite astonishing that this correspondence was published now in 2015 with great efforts, so many years after they both died. Neumann in 1960, Carl Jung half a year later in 1961. It runs like a thriller or a detective story, all the turns of having this correspondence published. A correspondence which many consider is Jung's most significant one. Maybe if we exclude Jung's correspondence with Freud, his correspondence with Erich Neumann is considered by many his most significant. They discuss deeper issues, not only day-to-day issues, they are there as well, personal intrigues, but also theoretical issues of clinical practice, of the God image, coming from their respective thought traditions. Both of them as you know, were steeped in German literature, philosophy, in Romanticism, in Enlightenment, but they came from different traditions. Jung from his Christian tradition, Neumann from his Jewish tradition. And what's particular about Neumann in that sense is that his Jewish background is significantly different from Freud's. Freud, who did say a number of times that he is very Jewish, he also said he doesn't know what that actually is. He wrote, in fact, I think it was in his introduction to one of the Hebrew translations of his works, he wrote that Freud expects science will once upon a time tell him what's Jewish about him. With Neumann, it's very different. Neumann combines something very Jewish with something deeply steeped in Jung's archetypal and analytical psychology. I believe that what is characteristically Jewish about Neumann is that his approach is midrashic, meaning that he interprets and reinterprets and make memories, even from the scriptures, come alive by very personal interpretation. In the book you mentioned, Jacob and Esau, it comes across in a profound sense. So I think there is a revival of Neumann, also due to the publication of the correspondence.
I'm taken by the symmetry that you were implicitly raising between the correspondence with Freud and the correspondence with Neumann. In terms of Jung's career, of course, the correspondence with Freud was quite early on. And Jung himself was in his own developmental phase. He had not truly gone through the kinds of experiences that would shape his later thought. By the time he and Erich Neumann got to know each other, he had been through the Red Book experiences. He had been through his own personal confrontation with the unconscious. And out of that, he seems to have spent the rest of his life with questions of great meaning and religious significance. And I think of the Freud statement of being a godless Jew and Neumann's archetypal approach. And so the fact that Jung was at first considered Freud's anointed heir, and then Neumann becomes Jung's anointed heir, is, I think, a symmetry that hasn't been fully appreciated yet. And I wondered if you had some thoughts for us on that.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Freud, nearly 20 years older than Jung, he obviously could not tolerate a too strong differentiation and could not tolerate Jung in his process of individuation. And Emma Jung, as you know, commented on that. Between Jung and Neumann, and they could fight, and they did. And Neumann was not an easy character. 30 years younger than Jung. In one of his first letters, very early on, he is furious with Jung and brings up the exploitation of the Nazis, or the risk of the Nazis exploiting Jung's psychology and Jung's statement, and Jung not being clear enough in his position against the Nazis. Neumann did not spare any ammunition. And yet, Jung and Neumann, Jung was able to tolerate and to keep the relationship, even the friendship with Neumann, in spite of this brilliant but so much younger protege of his. And I think that gives a lot of credit to Jung. And in his letter to Julie Neumann, after Erich's wife, after Erich Neumann died, he speaks about Erich as a companion on the road. And I do believe that that was very sincere from Jung, on Jung's side. He valued Neumann because Neumann was no yes man. Which brought him into conflict with the Zurich crowd around Jung, and Jung frequently defending Neumann against his close associates. I think Jung greatly appreciated that Neumann had his own views, that he could argue, that he could challenge Jung. And we see in some instances where Jung refined, for instance, his work on Answer to Job, following the dialogue with Erich Neumann.
Yes, I think that's really important about the correspondence, that so much of the correspondence, it's other correspondence that you can find in Jung's letters. He's often in a more kind of supervisory instructive role. And there are few people who are really up to the task of challenging him to the point of transformation. And I think of Jung's model of psychotherapy, that the therapist himself or herself must undergo a change through the encounter. And that's that piece of evidence that we have now in this new correspondence seems to me extremely valuable. From my own perspective, I've seen it with the Jung-Pauli letters, how Pauli, as a physicist, was able to take Jung to task on a number of issues around physics and really alter his thinking. And I think Neumann had great capacities to alter Jung's thought on numerous things, including some of his insensitivity, perhaps, in some of the ideas about anti-Semitism early in the 1930s.
Yeah, I think you're right. And many of the speakers, I think, will at the symposium will develop this even further, will extract from the material, which now is quite plenty. We have so much more today than we had only yesteryear. Several of the speakers will elaborate on these different aspects, which I think will mean that the symposium will be a great contribution to the material, to the new material that we gain access to concerning analytical psychology, Jung himself, as well as Neumann.
Yes, I mean, I think in that sense, in reading through the correspondence, there's an openness and a familiarity that often is not found in the published works, where we get inside the working of both men's minds, and it reveals the kind of deeper background that they're thinking through and bringing to bear on their ideas. And that leads me to ask you about Neumann's attending at the Eranos conferences and beginning to present there, because that was such a key component in the early development of the Jungian community. So I wonder if you can lead us into a little more understanding of his role, how he first began, and how he became such a important speaker over time.
Erich Neumann left Europe in 1934. On his way to the land of Israel, Palestine, he spent several months with Jung after leaving his native Germany. he saw very clearly what was happening in Germany, and he was already a convinced Zionist, determined to go to Israel. And so we see a break after the rise of Nazism. We see a break between Neumann and Europe that lasted for many years. He returned to Europe, I think, the first time after the war in 1947. And he is very clear about how he found a home at Eranos, an intellectual, spiritual home at Eranos, which he did not find in Zurich. In Zurich, he had to struggle with the analysts around Jung, who may have felt anger, perhaps envy vis-a-vis Neumann. There was no such thing at Eranos. From his initial attendance at the Eranos conference in the late 40s and until his last lecture in 1960, I think he was there every year. And after Jung stopped lecturing at Eranos, Neumann, in fact, came to take his place, or his own place, but as a central figure, or maybe the central lecturer at the Eranos Tagung, the Eranos conferences. His absolutely major works are all connected to his yearly Eranos lectures during the 1950s. From A Mystical Man to his later works, he wrote, of course, extensively about the feminine. Olga Fröbe, the anima, the muse of Eranos, who carried it to quite some an extent on her shoulders. She invited Neumann. Jung had invited him, of course, initially, but she invited Neumann over and over again, and she invited him to write an introduction to the picture archive of the Great Mother, which became one of Neumann's most significant works. Not only an introduction, became definitely a work in itself, by itself, with great significance. And it has had significance beyond the clinical. It has had quite a cultural impact, and you have cultural figures such as Camilla Pagli. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and I apologize for that, who wrote a wonderful review of the Great Mother, And he developed his writing about the feminine, about the moon consciousness, about the fear of the feminine, and quite a predecessor of feminism that was later to develop. And his writing on the earth, which precedes much of modern day eco-psychology. So he was quite at the forefront when it comes to the feminine and other cultural aspects that he dealt with. They were, of course, all cut short because of his premature death.
Do you think that his residing those years from 1934 through 1947 in Palestine, rather cut off from Europe because of the terrible events of the time, altered his perspective in terms of being a cultural observer? I'm interested in what you're saying about not only his clinical significance in terms of his theories, but the way in which, and I think in some ways maybe even more powerful, are his cultural commentaries, the way they take Jungian psychology and expand it in a direction that I think Jung started to pioneer, but didn't develop to the same extent that Neumann did. And I wonder about his being outside of Europe as an observer of what was happening as a significant contribution to that cultural understanding.
Oh, that's an intriguing question, Joe. Really very interesting. He arrived in Tel Aviv in 1934. Tel Aviv by then was barely 25 years old as a city or a town. People streamed into to that city, to Israel, from different corners of the world. There were prohibitions, and with the influx of Jews, there was an influx of Arabs. With the growing prosperity in the area, sometimes you can see images that are striking in the 1930s, where you see Tel Aviv almost as it is today, in the sense that there is a vibrant outdoor life. You see people dancing at the cafes near the beach, which seems striking when you consider that Nazism is on the rise beyond the horizon. And Erich Neumann, he lived near the sea. He wrote in German. He never wrote in Hebrew, even though he read Hebrew, and he drew from the ancestral sources. He drew from the earth of the land. But yet, I think he always had an eye to the Germany that he had left behind. In the 1930s and during the war, he was, of course, very aware of what was happening. His father died after the Nazis had attacked him around Kristallnacht in 1938. I think Neumann was very upset with Jung's aloof response when Neumann brought this to Jung's attention. But that was an aloofness that may have been characteristic of Jung in many respects. So Neumann, he did observe what was going on. He was intensely writing on Jewish subjects. Not only Jacob and Esau, which now is published 8 years after it was written, but he wrote an extensive work on the roots of Jewish consciousness, which, by the way, Anne Lammers is editing, and she will be presenting material that has never been presented before. It's only newly translated Mark Keiberts, by the way, who translated the Red Book.
Yes.
And Jacob and Esau is the translator of this very impressive, huge work. Neumann put it aside. After the war, he put it aside for a variety of reasons. I think one reason may have been that Gershom Scholem, with whom he was somewhat close, but who was a very critical person and who was not very fond of psychology, he criticized Neumann about this work, that he relied too heavily on Martin Buber. And there are additional aspects that Anne Lammers will present, which may have been the reason why Neumann put at least parts of this grand work aside and felt that they could no longer actually be presented after the genocide, after the Holocaust, after the Shoah.
Yes.
It seems to have caused an ambivalence in Neumann's way of relating to his own work. And after that, he in fact turned entirely to analytical psychology, writing his first work on depth psychology and a new ethic, which will be presented as well at the symposium, is of course an account with the Shoah, with the Holocaust, and with Nazism, which was not so well received in the Zurich circles around that time and felt as a kind of attack. He then very quickly presented his origins and development of consciousness. We do see in his later works, we can see their roots in his earlier, more Jewish-inclined works, which most definitely have relevance today, but seem to have caused great ambivalence in Neumann himself after the Holocaust.
Yes. Yeah, you raised several really interesting questions for me. One is about his isolation and his understanding of introversion, and the way he saw that in relation to extroversion and his new conception of centroversion. Because it feels to me it is something about the metabolizing of these things. That would be the first part. And the second thing I was struck by was the timing of this material coming out now. I notice in culture that there has been some revival, for example, of German Romanticism, including even the scientific dimensions of that. And it seems like we're at a place historically with enough distance from the horror of the Shoah to begin to rethink about the kinds of materials that had been obliterated because of that. And I see Neumann's material as a part of that new movement in cultural understanding and cultural history, and wondered if you saw that and how you saw his work on introversion and extroversion in that light.
I will try to expand a little bit beyond that. His original work on introversion and extroversion was followed up and deepened in his new ethic. Neumann followed a very interesting chapter in a book of Jung's written by someone called Hugo Rosenthal. In Jung's 1934 book about the reality of the psyche. Jung had intentionally invited this Hugo Rosenthal, about whom extremely little is known. And I will mention maybe a piquant detail about that. He had intentionally invited him in order to hit back at those who accused him of anti-Semitism. So he invited a Jew to write a chapter in his book in 1934, and he wanted to hit back at those who accused him of anti-Semitism as well. Hugo Rosenthal wrote about the typology in Judaism, mentioning introversion and extroversion. Rosenthal himself was an educator and not a psychologist. He had been asked by Leo Baeck, who was this extremely significant rabbi, to whom, in fact, Jung, after the war, conceded that he slipped up. And Leo Baeck had asked this Hugo Rosenthal to come to Germany. He lived in Israel at the time, to return to Germany to run a school for Jewish children during those difficult times. This was in the late 20s till the late 1930s. And Hugo Rosenthal then in the late 30s returned to Israel, changed his name to Yosef Yashuvi, and therefore Hugo Rosenthal disappeared from history. While he continued his important educational practices. Neumann was fascinated by this article, by this chapter of Rosenthal, and reviewed it and later expanded upon it, particularly the issue of introversion and extroversion from, of course, a more Jungian and psychological perspective than Rosenthal had made. So Neumann expands introversion, particularly to the psychology of Judaism. I would say to the psychological structure of Judaism. He writes about this in Jacob and Esau, which I will present at the symposium as well. And concludes with the significance of the introverted person or the introverted culture to recognize its own opposite, its inferior side in its own soul. And he uses the reconciliation between the two brothers, Jacob and Esau, as an example of how Jacob, representing the introverted, more sacred aspect of the Godhead, and Esau as the more outwardly or worldly extroverted aspect, and how after Jacob's struggle with the angel, which ends with a draw between God and man, also introversion and extroversion end with a draw. I do think that beyond introversion and extroversion, we know quite well how Jung has a cultural impact, but Neumann has as well. And I think that in postmodernism, and I think we will deal with this at the symposium as well, their respective dealings with the mass man, the atomized individual, aspects that I think are so pertinent to a world that I guess that neither Jung nor Neumann could even imagine, they managed quite well to imagine aspects that we now have to deal with and that certainly will be discussed and raised at the symposium.
Yes. And in terms of the introversion and extroversion, it seems to me one of the most important contributions was the recognition of the projection onto the other. And that is in itself, it requires at least some modicum of introverted awareness. So there's a subtle championing of the kind of evolutionary importance and development of an introverted perspective. And I have a sense that that was incubated for Neumann by his years in isolation, that it was part of what helped him form an even more profound version of this, I think, than Jung was articulating, and create an entire ethic around it. I think we've yet to fully appreciate that, and certainly in our election cycle here in the United States, with the kind of slinging of mud, we see how extroverted that kind of shadow material can become in contemporary culture.
That's a wonderful contribution. Thank you, Joe.
Well, thank you. I have another question that I'd like to raise. Right at the end of the correspondence between Jung and Neumann, and I was very glad to get the whole letter in the correspondence because I have used part of it before. But without seeing Neumann's, there's Jung's letter, but in the collected letters, but not the kind of letter that precipitated the remark. And so I was very struck at this. These are really the penultimate letters in the whole collection, where they are beginning to talk about a very vast scale. They're talking about evolutionary history and the way in which the psyche emerges out of the evolutionary process. And Neumann decries his pestering Jung in a way with these questions that he can't set down. But in fact, they are as far as I'm concerned, they generate some of the most interesting answers that Jung gives on the question, because Jung then has to take up the idea of unconscious synchronicities, the idea that even before consciousness is there, the potential to form meaning is happening in nature. And it creates a cosmological and cosmogonic view of the evolutionary process that I don't think is to be found anywhere else. And it's the dialogue between those two that rises up to the surface. And I wondered about Neumann's interest in these larger cosmic questions, and whether you had some thoughts about that.
Well, I agree that these last letters between the two makes for fascinating reading. I think that we here see how they come from different perspectives, and that's what makes their dialogue so tremendously fruitful at a very high level. I have had to reread those letters several times, and I feel that I still grasp them very partially, and they keep being intriguing. And I think that Neumann did come from some very Jewish perspectives in what he brings there. Jung maybe moves further ahead from his Christian perspectives. And we see a dialogue between two people who are not bogged down, not tied too strongly to where they come from, but they do have their definite roots from which they then elevate in that dialogue.
I wonder in some way, do they play Jacob and Esau to one another? Because there's a comment, I believe it was Neumann who made, who says, in some way, the ground, the soil for me is oriental. I mean, he's referring to the Near East, but in the language of the day. And yours, Jung, is occidental.
Yeah.
And the way in which things like Jung's late concept of synchronicity are an attempt to blend Eastern and Western kinds of philosophy and spirituality, that in some way they project upon one another and then try to work out their kind of, the gap between them is also not only between Judaism and Christianity, but between Eastern modes of thought and Western modes of thought.
What an interesting thought. I would agree with what you say. Neumann was, of course, steeped in the Occident.
Yes, of course.
That's from where he came. But the Eastern Earth is different.
Yeah, that's what I wanted you to say something about.
and influenced him from the very beginning, from the time he set foot in the land. And he, even though he lived right at the sea, and Israel is such a tiny country, from the sea to the border, it's 9 miles at the smallest part, but still it's very varied. And even if some parts of it are very Western, much of it is not. And from the very beginning, Erich Neumann identified the earth with the anima and with the African woman. Most of Jung's paintings we know. We don't know the Neumann paintings. They have not been shown. What will be particularly unique with the Neumann paintings is that at work, at presently, there is a comparison trying to be made between some of his drawings and paintings and dream material of his. Active imagination and dreams that, of course, have not been made public, so that we will hopefully be able to trace sequences. But the Eastern Earth was significant to Neumann and influenced him, even though his mind came from the West. The Earth was definitely the Eastern Earth that we see in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East.
Do you think that the tension between those two was part of his great interest in the creative? I mean, many of his works about art and the unconscious, the creative man and so forth, really go to the depths in terms of interest in creativity, the well springs of creativity. And I wondered what that meant to him in a more personal way.
Well, as Dvora Kuczynski, she's the grand old lady of Jungian analysis in Israel. She will soon be 91 years old and still practices as an analytical psychologist. And she was very close to Erich Neumann. She, of course, started as patient, supervisee, etc., but became very friendly and close to Erich Neumann. She and Micha Neumann, Erich's son, they were the ones to bring him back home when he fell sick during his trip to Europe and died soon afterwards. She speaks of Erich not as a psychologist, but as an artist. And Erich was an artist. We can see it in much of his writings and the way he writes. And that's where much of his interest was. His book about Henry Moore and other artists, that's obviously where his heart was and where he went whenever he was free to go fully his own way. If that caused, you're hinting that that may have caused conflict between him and Jung. I never thought of that.
Yeah. Well, Jung had an ambivalent relationship to modern art, as we know, in his critiques of Picasso or Joyce, most famously. But more generally, I think he was himself in that transition between the 19th century and the kind of artistic world there and the 20th century with all of the cultural upheaval. Whereas Neumann, for me, was always a person of the 20th century.
Yeah, true.
And so it seems the relationship to the art of the period is different between the two men.
Yeah, okay.
And that Neumann himself, when I was also wondering what, in the translocation to Palestine with the kind of Germanic education and training that he had, whether in the tension between those two experiences, that was part of the fueling of some of the creativity.
If we compare Jung and Neumann's artwork, we see that Jung is a much more refined artist. He is a painter. Neumann was not. Neumann's artwork is raw, but it's raw often in a very intriguing, challenging way. You have some very profound sexuality expressed in some of his drawings and paintings. So he was much less of a refined painter, but expressing the raw material without any censorship.
It sounds like it will be an exciting show and a chance to compare them at that level, not in terms of their intellectual discourse, but the way images moved through their psyches. There is one more question I'd like to raise before we conclude the interview, and that is, Neumann was, of course, a very prolific writer and speaker, and maybe the question's a little unfair, but I wonder what you think his most significant work is, especially for the contemporary audience.
Yeah, well, his contributions, he brought several contributions. I think that at the time, one contribution, a significant contribution, was to challenge analytical psychology as an outsider and somewhat an enfant terrible. He did not give in. He pushed, he brought his own things. He was quite fearless in challenging. So that's historically maybe one contribution, not so much the content of it, the different contents of his contributions in creativity, in pertaining to feminine psychology, I think are significant. To me personally, I believe that he brought a very significant contribution to the further understanding of the postmodern world that we live in. He, of course, did not really deal with postmodernism as a term, but when he speaks about the atomized individual, his term recollectivization. I think these are all very pertinent to the world we live in today, to the world that we are embracing tomorrow. And Jung, of course, has a tremendous contribution to this as well. But I think that somewhat differently, Neumann brings significant aspects that are well worth raising into our present consciousness and to develop further, which I hope will also take place during this symposium.
Mm-hmm. So this kind of intuitive forward arc of his thought.
Yes, based in the roots of the ancestral well springs, but from the particularism, I believe that both Jung and Neumann brought concepts, ideas, thoughts, notions that have universal value for our world today.
Well, thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to draw on your wisdom about Erich Neumann and his relationship with C.G. Jung, and for being such a important figure in spearheading this conference that we'll have at Pacifica as part of our 40th anniversary celebration. It's a real pleasure to have a chance to talk with you today.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a pleasure, and I think that it's a great credit to Pacifica to put a Jung-Neumann symposium as part of its celebration, and I think that's part of the revival that we can see taking place.
Yes,
Thank you,
it
Joe.
speaks to it. Thank you very much.